Hello, in the name of Allah, most compassionate, most merciful. Here in this presentation, I'm going to talk about approaches and methods for the teaching of English literature. For this, I'm going to go through two big axes. The first one, I will deal about literature and its connection with literary skills. What do we mean by literary skills? The development of critical thinking, exploration of different cultures and human behaviors, development of ideas, improve linguistic abilities, and enhance writing capabilities. In the second act, I'm going to talk about, which is the core of this presentation, suggested methods and techniques for the teaching of English literature. Here, I'm going to talk about the establishment of background knowledge, application of the formalist approach, setting the socio-historical and cultural background, designing reading activities, setting the setting discussions, applying a theory-based approach, and finally, I'm going to talk about the production phase. Okay. So, in talking about literature, of course, literature is a particular type of text which differentiates it from non-fiction text. And this difference, it has got this idiosyncratic features imply a particular treatment. And this particular treatment, of course, implies a particular way of introducing into the class. And misconceptions about literature always create a barrier, especially with our learners in their interaction with literary text. But if me as a teacher, I equip my learners with basic tools, basic notions about literature, I hope that it will make the learning of literature an enjoyable journey rather than a challenging task. Okay. So when I talk about literature, every teacher of literature, of course, before he comes into the class, he has got his philosophy of literature and has to develop his philosophy about the nature of literature. What is the aim of reading literary works? What is the contribution of literature, for example, in our society? What is the contribution of literature in the building of a human being? What is the connection of literature with society? What is the connection of literature with history, etc. And the second thing is the objectives. Me as a teacher, I have to set objectives behind introducing and teaching literature to my learners. The second point I should consider is the circumstances surrounding the literary class teaching. Here I mean the age of my learners, their level, their cognitive level, their culture, the time allotted, what motivates them, what does not motivate them. All this I should have a pre-knowledge about before I come into the class. This is one. And two, I should, of course, all teachers know that literature results in acquiring literary skills. And literary skills are very important for the cognitive growth of my learners. So it has got many benefits. When I teach literature to my students, they will come up with many different benefits. So what do we mean by literary skills? First and foremost, we mean by literary skills, they are a kind of competences which the individual acquires out of his interaction with fictional compositions. They include critical thinking, vocabulary, mastery, vocabulary accumulation, writing, the capacity to analyze a text and understand its core themes and characters and their motivations, and how to communicate effectively. Other definition, of course, states that literary skills refer to knowledge and techniques in reading, comprehending, interpreting, and communicating about literature. So, the first advantage of studying literature is results in the development of critical thinking. So as we said, critical thinking is a kind of thinking in which you question. It means I make my students ask questions, analyze, evaluate, interpret, and make a judgment about what they read, hear, or say, or write. So in literature class, students will practice expressing their opinions, drawing inferences within the text, or making connections between the text and the outside world, explaining cause and effect relationships, comparing facts, and applying ideas they have learned from literature to new situations. So students develop a perspective on the textual strategies of the writer, its message, and determine how it can relate to outside concepts. The second benefit from learning literature is acquiring, exploring different cultures and human behaviors. Here, of course, every work of literature is a new human experience. And when I say a human experience, it means is a new culture. So what do we mean by culture? Of course, we all know that culture, of course, there are many definitions to culture, but to state this one, it is a wide term to define. It includes language, ideas, beliefs, customs, taboos, codes, institutions, tools, techniques, works of art. It also associates values, beliefs, knowledge. Primarily, culture demonstrates itself in the works of art, in literature, language, as well as the verbal and non-verbal behaviors of people. So in seeing the connection between literature and culture, we can say that literature, in its part, conveys these beliefs and values of society through its language. Okay? So in fact, literature is a reflection of society and the spirit of its time. What happens in society is directly or indirectly reflected in literature. This is why in the examination of literature, it needs to be within its social, political, and economic context in which it has been written or has been received. So there is, students will come up with a new experience, will come up with a new culture, with a new ideas about a different culture, a new culture. Also, the learning of literature results in the development of ideas, of course. Through reading literature, we encounter other viewpoints and opinions. This would help in fostering the understanding of the other and creating empathy and acceptance to those other than our own. Furthermore, it addresses our assumptions and leads us to critically consider the world around us. It has also shown to be a place for social and political commentary that motivates people to act accordingly. Also, literature, the study of literature improves the linguistic abilities of the learners. Literary texts are a rich source for linguistic input. It helps students to practice the four skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, in addition to models of syntactical and lexical structures. And they can use the syntactical and lexical structures they encounter in the text, they can use later in their speaking or in their writing. Students will learn the diverse use of words, of course, phrases, phrasal verbs, multiple meanings, and idioms. Enhanced writing capabilities. So this is related to the linguistic abilities, which will result in writing capabilities. So the frequent exposure to literary works enables students to catch syntactic structures and lexical items which they could use in their writing activities, and later they could also develop on them. The literary text is a model where students adopt also the style and way of thinking of writers. Now we come to the practical part in teaching, what I suggest for the teaching of literature. So here I can divide it into two parts. The first part, which I consider teacher-centered part, here in which the teacher equips the students with preliminary knowledge about some notions related to literature. So before I set my students interact with the literary text and ask them to analyze whatever there in the text, I have to be sure that my students have got the tools to address this literary text. So, as I said earlier, so first and foremost is the philosophy that the teacher, of course, talking about the teacher of literature, holds about the nature of literature, the objectives behind the teaching of literature, and the circumstances surrounding its teaching, taking into consideration the age of the learners, their interests, their cognitive level, and their culture. For this reason, teachers differ in the way they present literature into the class. Of course, according to the literature I have read, every scholar has got his own way of presenting and teaching literature. So it is impossible that all teachers come with a unified method or approach or technique for the teaching of literature, of course. So, as I said, the first part in introducing literature to the class is featured by it is feature-centered approach, because here it is the teacher who is going to equip the learners with some basic literary notions, because they will need them later, they will recall them when they start their interaction with the literary text. Here, the teacher-centered approach, it is referred to what I call the establishment of background literary knowledge. There are some notions that I have to be clear with my students about that. The first one is, what do we mean by in literature we interpret and not explain or paraphrase. Most of the time, students in their writing, we see them, they are either summarizing the story or explaining or paraphrasing, very far from what we mean by interpreting. So in interpreting, we go beyond the literal meaning of the story. Okay. For example, if we take, for instance, the story written by James Joyce, Evelyn. Okay. It is a very famous and known story. It is about a girl who works in a factory at the beginning of the 20th century, and who takes care of her alcoholic father and her two brothers. Her mother is dead. One day she met with a guy. I think his name is Frank. They loved, etc. She loved him, etc. And he promised to marry her, but with the condition that he takes her away from her home. So this Evelyn was in a dilemma to decide whether to stay or to leave, to stay taking care or to leave her father, etc. So it was a dilemma to come up in the end with a decision to stay. And this is the end of the story. So this is the literal story, and this is the surface meaning of the story. And this, but if we go to interpret here, I read that critics come with different interpretation to the story. Okay, one critic, for example, or some critics say that the story is reflecting or dealing with the situation of the woman in Britain in general, or Ireland in the 20th century, at the early 20th century Ireland. Other critics say that the story has got far political implications, okay, calling for political action. So this is interpretation. Okay. Also, for interpretation, for example, we interpret literary devices, the symbols. The symbols have got their literal and they have got their deep meaning. Irony, allusion, etc. Character construction. We are going to talk more about characters in the coming talk. Character construction and its connection to the theme of the writer aims to deliver. So, the second notion I have to make clear with my students is, what do you mean by literary genre? Sorry. A literary genre, we mean by literary genre, novel, poem, drama, biography, autobiography, among many, of course. And I have to make it clear for my students that every literary genre has got its feature. Because in the light of this, when they read the literary text, they will take into consideration its features. And this would help them to make their predictions and assumptions about the work they are reading. Third notion is what we mean by elements of fiction. We know that every literary work, whether it is a novel, a short story, a poem, has got elements which comprise it, which make up it. Such elements like we can talk about point of view, about characters, time, place, tone, mood, language devices, and figures of speech and plot. So knowledge about the features and the function of each element is crucial during the analysis. For example, I have to introduce to my students what do you mean by point of view. What are the types of point of view? There is the first person narrator, there is the third person narrator with each type, there is the second person narrator, but this is of course rarely used. But the point is that every type of point of view has got a function. So when my students should learn the function of every point of view. So when they come up with across a literary text, they can understand and interpret why does the writer has chosen this particular point of view instead of another point of view. This is the same for characters. What information I give to my students about characters. Here I explain to them that there are different modes of characterization in every literary text, in every literary work. Writers differ in the way how they present their characters. They are different and a variety of characterizations. For example, sometimes we see writers present their characters directly through their actions. Okay, so they do not require from the student, the learner, yes, to make efforts in order to interpret the personality of this character. But sometimes we see writers focus on physical description, moral description. Sometimes the physical description gives insight about the moral of the character. So we have to pay attention to the way how the writer describes his character. Sometimes the writer presents a character through a dialogue. That means two other characters talking about the main character. Here I have to ask my students to be aware, to pay attention to what do these two people talk about this character, because it is very significant in the building of my character and interpretation, of course. The same for time, the same for place. Time, for example, there is foreshadow. How does the writer employ foreshadow in a narrative? There is flashback. What is the function of flashback in a narrative? For place, how does a place? It can be any place. A room, a home, garden, a meadow, city, town, country, sea, the sea, forest, university, classroom, any place. Here, when the writer describes, you see a focus on, sometimes the description of the place is just to build the narrative. But sometimes it is suggestive. It is significant. It conveys something. It is connected. Sometimes the description of place gives insights about the character's state of mind. Sometimes the description of place has connection with the theme of the writer. The point is, the learner should not take the description of place for granted. Okay? The same for tone, mood, sometimes, so it depends, okay? We have to look whether it is suggestive and whether it is only for the construction of the narrative. The same for the language devices and figures of speech and plot. The second, so the idea is that these elements of fiction should not be taken for granted, as I said. On the contrary, the way each element is constructed is substantially connected to the writer's textual strategies and meanings. Therefore, while reading any literary text, the learners would automatically recall this information and project it in his analysis process. Fourth notion, literary notion, is what we mean by a literary movement. Literary movement is the period, literary, it refers to a literary period. For example, we can talk about classicism, about colonialism in America, we can talk about classicism, romanticism, naturalism, realism, enlightenment, modernism, postmodernism. These are literary movements which are connected to a particular period of time in history. And every literary movement has got its features. So when I come up with literary work, I can relate it through its date of publication. I can relate it to each literary movement. And having knowledge about the features of this literary movement is very significant to help me in understanding the features in this literary text that I am reading, literary text that is at hand. So the literary work is produced in a particular period of time. And each period of time belongs to a particular literary movement. Consequently, it is recommended that the learners grasp the notion of a literary movement and its features. In this regard, they can read the text in the light of the ideas and features of such a movement. Such knowledge would shed its light on the comprehension of the text. Now, a literary theory. The theory is introduced to literature many years ago, and it has shown to be very fruitful in helping in reading literary text from a particular perspective. They also help us in avoiding biased interpretations, and they help in reading literary work in general. So, and of course, what you mean by literary theory? Theory is a set of principles. So, literary theories have been introduced to the teaching of literature for many years ago. Theories enable the learners to read the text from a particular standpoint according to the way he sees the message of the writer. To some extent, literary theories prevent from biased readings. In fact, they are principles that guide the learners to pay attention to particular issues and strategies within the text. Thus, knowledge about literary theories and their diversity is indispensable in literary criticism. Sorry. So this is the step, what do I call teacher-centered approach, in which the teacher equips the learner with basic literary knowledge. So then the teacher moves from teacher-centered approach to learner-centered approach, leaving more space for the students to explore the text independently under his guidance, who sets clear objectives in designing the activities.